Hello, Linda Lyons. This is Mrs. Worm, and today we're going to read about an important figure in American history, George Washington Carver. This book is by Rebecca Gomez. We have our table of contents, and we're going to start with Who is George Washington Carver on page 4. Who is George Washington Carver? George Washington Carver was a famous scientist. He invented many new things from peanuts, soybeans, and sweet potatoes. Some of these things are plastic, shoe polish, and peanut butter. George Washington Carver was a teacher too. He taught people how to be better farmers. And we actually have a picture of the gentleman right here. George's family. George Carver was born near Diamond Grove, Missouri. He was born around 1864. No one is sure of his birthday. George and his family were slaves. Susan and Moses Carver owned them. In 1865, slavery ended and George's family was free. George never knew his father. His mother was kidnapped when he was a baby. So George and his brother Jim lived with Susan and Moses Carver. The Carvers treated them like their own children. And it says here, young George lived in a log house. The plant doctor. Young George liked to walk in the woods. He enjoyed studying the plants and insects he found. George had a talent for growing things. He grew a special garden for himself. George learned which plants liked the sun, and he learned which plants favored shade. The people of Diamond Grove began calling George the plant doctor. And this is a picture and it says George Carver later became a plant teacher. So that's him on the left there. Going to school. George wanted to go to school, but the only school in Diamond Grove was for white students. Back then, African Americans like George went to African American schools. In 1877, George left Diamond Grove. He went to the African American school in Neosho, Missouri. It was 8 miles away from Diamond Grove. This says George Carver with his classmates at Iowa Agricultural College. George found some nice people to live with in Neosho. Mariah and Andy Watkins cared for George. He helped Mariah around their house. And it says this microscope belonged to George Carver. It's probably in a museum now. George learned all he could in Neosho. Then he moved to Kansas. George went to many different schools in Kansas. George worked at different jobs too. This was not an easy way of life, but George wanted to keep learning new things. So he's really striving and he's working hard for his dreams. In Olaf, Kansas, there was another person named George Carver. People were mixing up George with the other George Carver, so George gave himself a middle name. This is how George Carver became George Washington Carver. It says he gave himself the middle name Washington. College. Around 1884, George Washington Carver finished high school. He wanted to go to college next. George got a letter from Highland College that said he could go there. George showed up for school, but Highland College told him to leave. Highland College did not want any African American students, which is wrong. After high school, George bought some land and grew wheat. In 1890, George tried going to college again. He went to Simpson College in Iowa. There, George studied art. George's teacher discovered that George knew a lot about plants. Her name was Etta Budd. It says Etta Budd at the bottom, I believe here, with her family. Etta Budd told George he should go to Iowa Agricultural College. There he could study plants. George Washington Carver was the first African American to go to Iowa Agricultural College. He studied plants and agriculture. Later, George became the first African American teacher there. And here's a piece of artwork that says George Washington Carver became a talented plant scientist. Tuskegee. In 1896, George Washington Carver began teaching at the Tuskegee Institute. This was a college for African Americans in Tuskegee, Alabama. Booker T. Washington started this school in 1881. It says George Washington Carver, top left, at the Tuskegee Institute. And then a stamp of Booker T. Washington, who started the college in 1881. Carver was the head of agricultural studies at Tuskegee Institute. He taught his students about plants and soil. Carver brought his students outside to learn about nature. He cared about his students, and they learned a lot. And it says here, another picture, he studied plants in his free time. Carver showed farmers new crops to grow. Carver helped nearby farmers too. He taught them how to take care of their soil. Farmers learned how to rotate crops. Carver showed them new crops to grow. Southern farmers began planting black-eyed peas, sweet potatoes, and soybeans. Carver and Peanuts. So some of you may have heard George Washington Carver's name before. You might already know what he's invented. Let's see what else he's done. At one time, people mostly used peanuts to feed farm animals. Carver invented over 300 more uses for peanuts. He made medicines, soap, and many foods from peanuts. Carver's peanut oil helped people suffering from an illness called polio. It says George Washington Carver made peanuts famous. So if you've ever had a peanut butter and jelly, or you just like snacking on peanuts, he might be one of the reasons why it's so popular. He is the reason why. World famous. George Washington Carver's discoveries made him famous. The Royal Academy of Arts in England made Carver a member. In 1939, President Franklin D. Roosevelt gave Carver a medal. President Roosevelt thanked Carver for all of his hard work. It says this is George Washington Carver on the left with Henry Ford, who is another famous inventor. Carver enjoyed sharing what he knew with people. He could have made a lot of money from his inventions, but being rich was not Carver's goal. Helping people made him happy. On January 5th, 1943, George Washington Carver died. People today still use many of his inventions. Some of Carver's other famous inventions are buttermilk, chili sauce, ink, instant coffee, mayonnaise, metal polish, and shaving cream. He has done a lot. So that was just a short glimpse into the life, creations, inventions, and hard work of George Washington Carver. I hope you guys enjoyed learning and listening as much as I always enjoyed reading. Have a great day.